This is Chris J, and I'm here with Sarah Abair, my co-producer and head of all things awesome at All Y'all. And we have the privilege today of interviewing Mr. Alton Warwick, who is locally known in Shreveport and around the country. Now you are the owner of the Louisiana Hayride trademark and the Louisiana Hayride brand. Isn't that right, Mr. Alton?
That's right. We're fortunate. My wife was Margaret, was the leading person, having been on the hayride itself, to go to the time and effort to get that trademark. So we're hopefully we'll carry on in some fashion without her being here, but it'd be not the same.
She was an absolute civic leader in Shreveport, Louisiana, and around the country. She was honored with awards for her work in New Orleans and elsewhere. Before we get into talking about the Louisiana Hayride, can we just talk a little bit about your late wife, Margaret, and how she and you both saved, I feel like I remember that you saved Shreveport Municipal Auditorium from the wrecking ball at one point.
Yes, that's one thing I do know about, because as they say, I was there. But as I remember it vividly, the Tourist Bureau had asked us to, or her particularly, to do a tour for some guests from England that wanted to, of course, see the auditorium where Elvis and Hank and all those guys were. So it was a Saturday, as I remember vividly. It was raining, pouring down rain, and so as we progressed upstairs to show them the upstairs, they had buckets catching the water coming through the roof, and so she asked the superintendent of the building, said, "Why don't the city patch this roof?" And he says, "We're not going to do that. We're going to tear this building down." And so she said to her, after we left, "I'm going to see if that does not happen." So through my work at ARCLA, I happen to know a lot of the representatives and state representatives, and so she asked me if I would call a meeting of those key guys to see if they could do something to save that building, since the city had, in effect, turned its back on it. So did, and several of those guys stepped forward. Hoppy Hopkins, who is now deceased, Billy Montgomery, Foster Campbell. They went down to the Baton Rouge Capitol and pleaded the cause, were successful in that quest, and the result of, we got $2 million to begin the restoration of that building. That building has 7 roofs on it, so the repairing the roofs took $500,000. However, once that was done, then people started saying, well, maybe we should look into raising some money locally, since all the seed money came, not a dime came from the city of Shreveport. All came from the state of Louisiana. So the mayors at that time and some other people formed a committee, and my wife was heading it up, Friends of the Auditorium. And from that effort, it grew, and more funds were raised, and the result of it is now a functioning building that's on the historic register, and I think everyone can be proud of that it was not destroyed.
Also designated a National Historic Landmark for the role that it played in the birth of, so many American musics.
Well, the building was more than just the hayride, because I was growing up here. I used to see wrestling every Wednesday and Friday, and the ice capades were there, the whole Harlem Globetrotters. So that was a social building of its time for everything. There was no other building in Shreveport that could hold those type of events. So it was more than the hayride, and hayride was a large part of it, but it was a building that should have been preserved. In fact, the morgue was in that building. I got my first polio shot in that building. The health department was there. So it had a long and successful history, and it's very ornate and needed to be preserved regardless of the hayride.
I think it's particularly beautiful and poetic that a performer from the Louisiana Hayride then years later helped save it from the wrecking ball, because Margaret, your late wife, was not only an activist and a businesswoman, but she was a performer alongside all the big names on the Louisiana Hayride. Now, this is dating back to when she was 15 years old. She came in second place in a talent contest, I remember reading. That may be wrong.
Nope.
But then she got invited onto the Hayride stage, I think when she was only like 16 years old.
She was from Levelland, Texas, West Texas. She's a 5th generation West Texan. So the hayride would do, Johnny Horton and Tillman Franks would do sort of like talent shows out in the area around Louisiana. And so they held one in out in her neck of the woods in Levelland. So she joined that. Her band in high school was Margaret Lewis and the Thunderbolts. So they invited her to be guest on the hayride anyway. So that one act of Johnny Horton and Tillman having that show changed her life, because she moved to Shreveport following that, was on the hayride, and when the hayride closed, she was her and my cousin Myra moved to Nashville, became actively involved in the music business in Nashville. So that was the turning point of her life.
Would you mind telling me a little bit about, and before we move on, I want to put a mention in for listeners. If you've never heard Margaret Lewis's music, a lot of us in Shreveport think of her as Maggie Warwick, and that was her name, but look up Margaret Lewis's music, especially if you like rockabilly, because holy smokes, there are some barn burners. She recorded some great tunes.
Yeah, the strangers is my cousin Myra. Actually, there were two women recording in the late 50s and early 60s, R&B, gospel, rockabilly, black artists. Ram had integrated musicians in that studio.
Ram was Myra's record label.
Myra's record label, and from those recordings, they moved to Nashville after the hayride closed and closed the record store down. However, in the late 80s or early 80s, got a call from a guy from, I could tell by his accent, from England, and he wanted to know if Myra had died by that time, and we had those old recordings that she had worked so hard, and Margaret did too. And he was looking for those owners of those tapes, and I said, well, we do have them. He said, well, you wouldn't happen to know where Margaret Lewis is, would you? I said, yeah, she's in there cooking supper. Would you like to talk to her? So from that conversation, Ray Topping with Ace Records in London came to Shreveport. And we had a lot of, Myra and Margaret had a lot of those recordings that never saw the light of day, because single women in those days, it was tough to borrow money, especially if you were in the music business. So a lot of those great recordings never got released on record. And from that visit, Ace Records put out 5 of those CDs. A lot of those had never been released before. Put out a whole album on Margaret called Lonesome Bluebird.
And they're tremendous. If you're listening and you've never heard these records, if you're interested in Louisiana music or Shreveport music, please go out and find those releases. I think mostly from the early 2000s or somewhere in there, of Margaret Lewis's records. They are great.
In fact, Ace just called me about a month ago, and they wanted to update some of that. Wanted to put out another CD on Margaret's for some of the recordings that they did not include in that. So they'll be coming out in a month or so.
That's so cool. You mentioned earlier, they were both single women working in the music industry. I can only imagine how hard that was.
There were very few, especially Myra, who was a talented engineer, a great blues guitar player, a songwriter, and so you had two women that I had just got out of tech, and I had gone to work for Arkansas, so I wasn't exactly bringing home a load of money. So the budget was tight, and they were playing shows all over the Gulf Coast. In fact, Johnny Winter was in Margaret's band, her early band, was playing the West Coast.
I had no idea. Johnny Winter?
Gulf Coast, yeah, Johnny Winter.
Wow.
He was from Beaumont. Of course, and,
I had no idea.
Yeah, I've got some pictures of him on stage, and he actually did a couple of recordings with her.
Well, I feel like, do you want to shift to the hayride, or you look like you've got a question?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, we could talk on. I mean, it's
No. It's just so fascinating. We can talk all day.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
One thing I wanted to ask you is, do you remember the first time that you met Margaret? Do you remember the first time you saw her?
Yes, I do. Johnny Horton, as I was saying, had brought Margaret down to meet Myra. He said she toured with Johnny a while, and he said, I think a lady here in town could, I think y'all could work together and be beneficial. So he brought her out to the record shop, and they did hit it off, both had like styles and everything. So I was living with, in fact, Myra's mother, and also obviously I got to meet Margaret, and so I was being the fast worker that I am. 17 years later, we got married, so that shows you what. But anyway, they moved off to Nashville, but I still kept close contact with her because her mother, Myra's mother, I lived with them. I took care of them, and so we'd go up there to visit, and I did all their income taxes and all their book work. So we kept in close contact, and suddenly one of those times that Myra got sick, we had the occasion to spend more time together, and boom, there it happened
Right.
finally. And everybody said, "Oh, you're having a hard time adjusting, at your age." Wasn't in the adjustment at all. So, anyway, that's my story.
Well, it's fascinating to me that someone who performed on the hayride took this long route, it took a route around the bend and ended up owning it. Can you tell me how the hayride came into to your life? It sounds like you were working on becoming a professional. You know what I mean?
Yeah. We had no intention of getting involved in the hayride when she came back. We were doing other things, and
when would this have been, Alton? Would it have been?
This was we got married in 1981. So the first occasion that we had to revisit the hayride was when LPB and was doing the Cradle of the Stars beginning. So Margaret said, I need to talk to her because, so we did. We met with Beth and Rick Smith at that time. So we worked on that event, and so from that association, I think a few years had passed, and the Tourist Bureau knew Margaret was on the hayride from that thing. Said, ask her if she could put on a hayride type show for visitors from there. So she said, okay. So that began the revival in her music career of the hayride. So one thing led to another, and those shows grew, and so we acquired the trademark, and so from that event, I think the Cradle of the Stars had a lot to do with her resurrection of participation in the Louisiana hayride.
I'm sorry, I cut you off earlier, Sarah.
Oh, no, it's okay.
Well, do you feel like what you and Maggie became sort of this single figure in town? I would see y'all together, and you were always out beating the drum for the hayride, not just as a cultural legacy of North Louisiana and the region, but an economic engine for the area, all the possibilities. What did y'all want to see achieved with the bringing back of the Louisiana hayride?
It's her vision. I was along for the ride and do what I could to help, but she was by far the visionary, the encourager, the cheerleader, and the doer. And her vision was that Shreveport had a jewel in the making, in the rough, and that it needed to be revised, modernized. You can't bring back the old, but you can build on it. So that the history of the hayride was something that you could be an economic engine to drive development around the auditorium. And from that vision, she formed a group called FAME, which was going to develop the Ledbetter Heights district into a music and economic landmark. So unfortunately that did not work out, but it wasn't for her lack of effort and the determination.
That's right.
So, Alton, what was it like seeing her do this second act of her career during this time?
Pardon me, what did?
What was it like for you to see her go through this second phase of her career?
It was a blessing to me.
Oh,
You take your time.
Yeah. Here, I'm gonna get some tissue.
Yeah, absolutely. You take your time. We know this stuff's not easy, and I'm sorry. I work with my wife too, so it's almost the same exact situation. Sarah leads, it's her vision, and I'm just, yes, dear, you know? She'll tell me, we got to put on a show. Yes, dear.
Yeah.
I will set up the chairs.
Absolutely.
What makes it hard is that,
Oh,
yeah.
we got you, Sarah, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It's okay.
I've already forgotten to close the door.
But anyway, she worked so hard
Yes, yes.
and realized a few of the dreams.
Mhm.
I think one of the well, I'm getting back on. It was a time in my life that I would have never had. That the first of all, she was my favorite singer. Period, and I said that many times before we even married. So I was privileged to work beside her and to see her enthusiasm and courage and determination in every project that she took on. I had some misgivings about them, but she never did.
We need people like that.
Absolutely.
We need people to say, you know what? It might fail, but who cares?
Right. If you don't try, you'll never succeed.
That's right.
And that's pretty much her outlook on life.
I think it takes crazy people to move things forward,
That's
to
right.
say, you know
Yeah.
what? It looks like it's not doable. Let's do it.
And that was a trouble that, unfortunately, in the Fame Project, some people thought it was too visionary, too big of a step to take, too much to swallow, but she did not think so, and it wasn't for lack of trying.
Well, I admire her a great deal because I think when she started her career, women were not seen as leaders in that field at all. They were probably seen a little bit as a novelty, right?
Particularly in that line of work, because girl singers were just to sing. They were not supposed to make waves. They were not supposed to produce records. They were not supposed to lead the band. But her and Myra was just as determined as she was, and they were not going to go quietly into the night. So in Nashville and all of those places, they made a mark in a man's world. In fact, they wrote a lot of R&B stuff that the men weren't writing because they were doing it down here, and they had 2 songs in that Nashville. They won the Grammy, Night Train to Nashville. They had only 2 R&B songs, especially written by women, of anybody that had a competition in that CD. So it was, they brought to Nashville the same enthusiasm and direction and talent that they had in Shreveport.
It's pretty funny listening, or not funny. I can say
Yeah.
funny because I'm a man, but listening to the recent Bear Family Records Louisiana Hayride box
Yeah,
set,
right.
which is tremendous. And if you can check it out from the library, if you can get your hands on it, listen, it is wonderful. And I listened to it start to finish, and just about every woman who's introduced on that show is introduced on the basis of how cute she is.
Yes,
Yeah, right.
so pretty. Yeah.
Yeah.
Look how she's dressed up tonight. She's dressed up
Yeah,
like a little
yeah,
cowboy.
right, yeah.
They never do that for
Yeah.
the men.
and if you heard, Margaret had, I think, 4 songs that were, the recording survived, but Myra was playing the lead guitar, and you had I think Myra played not only the lead guitar, but the blues guitar. And if you listen to those cuts, you can tell they were not cut in Nashville. So she is the only woman that ever played the electric guitar, period, let alone the lead guitar. So they were breaking ground here in Shreveport as well as Nashville. So I think that's a point to be brought out of her competition or success and able to compete in the man's world, so to speak.
When you two were able to see that project come to fruition before she passed, which when I hold it in my hands,
Yeah.
we're looking at it right now as we record this. I got it on the table in front of me. This is the first thing I feel like that has been done, and I haven't read everything, I haven't heard everything, that really does the subject justice. It's so good.
Well, it took Martin Hawkins that did the lead story on it, and he's from England. In fact, she met Martin in Nashville when she was working for Shelby Singleton. He was doing a story on Sun Records, so we knew he was top quality. The mass of material that he had to go through to figure out exactly what to include was a task to be reckoned with. Took a couple of years. He wanted to pay homage and tribute to not only the stars, but some of the other artists that were not well known, but were part of the hayride, and they contributed a lot to the success of that show. So he set about to make sure that he tried to give them due recognition of the effort that they put forth to make that event a success, and I think he did a good job on it.
I believe the best part of the whole thing is that I think Elvis Presley, his presence on the hayride, has in a way overshadowed so much else that happened. And in this wonderful comprehensive Louisiana Hayride box set, Elvis is not exactly a footnote, but he's not the main attraction.
That's right, and that was not by accident. Martin wanted to give him, of course, a significant recognition, but he didn't want him to overwhelm the other parts of the staff that contributed to it. And I don't think Elvis would have wanted it that way. I think he would have liked the people that backed him up, the artists that came on before him and after him, to have due recognition. And I think Martin was able to sift through all that material and find the right balance. You and your late wife Margaret were clearly music industry insiders. Do you have any personal treasured memories of any of those other cast members, whether we're talking Hoot and Curly or Johnny Horton or Kitty Wells? I mean, I realize you were making money in the oil and gas industry at the time, but you probably still would have met with them. I really did not meet with a lot of them because I was in a different world as far as that, and we never crossed paths, particularly after Margaret and Myra, because the hayride shut down shortly after
1960 or so?
Yeah, it was as a regular Saturday night show at the end of 1960, and due mainly to economics of the thing and the fact that the artists had moved to Nashville because Freeport
didn't capitalize.
Could not compete with the infrastructure of Nashville, and so the talent pool dried up significantly. But I do remember a few of them that would come by the studio. In fact, Claude King did some cuts out at the Ram studio, and Johnny Horton came out and did some demos before they went to Nashville to work on their material. And so it was a time that will never be repeated, probably, but it was glorious in this day.
Do you feel like, well, let me ask you a question. And I don't know, I hope that this isn't too much to ask of you. And I'm going to let you get a sip of water because we've had you talking for a long time.
I tend to overtalk.
Well, it's fun. I love to talk to people like you. But the Louisiana Hayride brand, the identity of the Louisiana Hayride is something that's in American history now alongside, it's always going to be there. It is an iconic building block of American pop culture. It's going to outlast you, and it's going to outlast me and everyone else in this room. Where do you see it, or what do you hope for it? 20 or 50 years down the line, what do you think the Louisiana Hayride will mean to people?
Boy, I wish I could tell you. I wish I had a clue. I would be somebody has to have a magic ball that I don't have. I would hope that somewhere, sometime, someone could use that as a stepping stone for a hayride show, or the recognition of the people who slaved under severe handicaps, both technology and the times that were hard back then. I know you can't repeat history, but you can learn to build on it, and that it would be a way to keep it alive. I just don't know. I wish I had a better answer.
I feel like
you.
that there is that golden age of rock and roll, rockabilly, country music. So much, the very beginnings of so much of that happened right here in Shreveport, and I hope that the world remembers that.
Yeah, you know, the great change in music occurred significantly at the Hayride, because up until that time, you know, you had the big bands, you had folk music and all, but Elvis came up on the scene, and the rest is history. So everybody wanted to start imitating Elvis, and Hayride was no different. So right here in Shreveport, you had a good case history of how that event happened, and was a part of it right here in town. So it was not only a show, but it was a part of the turning point in the history of American music.
I think that's great.
Yeah.
Wow.
Did I forget anything?
I wanted to ask Mr. Warwick, you went to the Hayride show. You went to a couple of shows at some point. Can you tell me start to finish what that was like? You'd walk up to the municipal, and then what?
Well, it was very unstructured. That, you know, people would come up to the stage and hand requests to Frank and them, you know, and take pictures and all. So it was nothing like the mega shows now, where you sit in the football stadium and, you know, have to have binoculars just to see the stage. So it was a more intimate surroundings, and the municipal auditorium is big enough but small enough that you can do that, and the acoustics are so great that you didn't have to have a bank of speakers and
Right.
and technology to be heard. And so I think the friendliness and the intimacy that existed at that time was something that is now missing in these big structured shows, that everybody's dancing and swinging, and trapeze artists, and, you know, so that it's a show more of a performance than it is
A spectacle.
Yeah, it's a spectacle. Exactly right. Yeah, and back then it was there for the music, you know, and so it was a different time, a different era. But
I've always wanted to ask someone this, and you don't have to answer it if you don't want to. The more I read about the Hayride, and this will be my last question, but the more I read about the Hayride, the more I think it kind of sounds like Elvis, and I'm just going to say it, but it kind of sounds like Elvis kind of ruined it in the way that I listened to the whole box set, and you can hear after he leaves, you can hear the audience and the performers change in a way that doesn't seem to work as well as before he was there.
You know, that point was brought out in that DVD, The Cradle of the Stars. Elvis did change, but it was Hayride was no getting around it, because everything changed. Not only did it change the Hayride, but it changed the world, so that the impact of Elvis, you had a different crowd that started coming in. You had the younger crowd, and that's inevitable in any society. The music's going to change and the crowd's going to change, but the younger people coming in that support it. So it did change, and I think the evolution at that time did have an impact. It had an impact on the Opry. The Opry didn't suffer. The Opry suffered because of it. They had a period of time to deal with that. And the only reason the Opry survived is because they had the music infrastructure there to support the audience, and that the WASM was owned by National Life Insurance, and they had a advertising, significant advertising brand that the Opry filled. They would sell these front what do they call them, front porch policies, I guess, where the guy would come around every week and collect the burial insurance money for the premium. They listened to the Grand Ole Opry. So National Life said that we're keeping the Opry on the air regardless because it sells life insurance policies. Hayride didn't have that. They had no
Wow.
sponsor that was willing to benefit from the Hayride being on there. So
Right.
that Elvis that contributed to that, but so did other things. The Beatles didn't help any.
Right.
And,
The poodle skirts.
yeah,
Right.
And so times change, and nothing you can do about it but try to participate if you can. If not, find something else.
What's funny to me is that you often can't pinpoint the moment when times change. But I feel like in that recording of Elvis on stage at the Hayride on October 16th, 1954, you can actually hear American culture change in that moment.
That was a defining point in the music of, not only the music but the culture. The culture of people changed. It had a bigger impact on society as a whole.
The star,
Defining point in the point
Yes.
of history.
So sort of the birth of celebrity culture in a way.
Yeah.
I mean that broadcast range that the Hayride had was just too big to ignore.
Yeah, and TV was coming in at that time, so it was all multitude of things were coming about that were hard to digest in a business sense.
Well, I don't know. It's a weird thing to say to someone, but I just want to say I don't know how often you hear thank you for keeping it rolling through the hard times and the good, because the Hayride could be a footnote in history now. The Shreveport Municipal Auditorium could be a parking lot. And
Yeah, they need a parking lot down there, don't they? Because of the crowds.
And well, you and Maggie kept that from happening for decades. You guys just pushed it, and you didn't let it get torn down. And I thank you so much, and I thank her. And I know that you two will see one another again soon.
You bet.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank y'all.